The title, as you see, it's Neocatharsis and Working Through Ferenczi and the Empathic Clinical Style. First of all, I would like to thank the Società Italiana di Psicoanalisi e Psicoterapia Sándor Ferenczi for inviting me to take part in this preparatory event for the conference in Madrid next year. I feel truly honored, and I thank the organizers, especially Ornella Piccini and Carlo Bonomi, friends, I'm happy to say, with whom I have been working on the ISFN, International Sándor Ferenczi Network Board, in recent years. I'd like to thank as well Luis Martin Cabré, President of the next conference, for coming all the way from Spain to be with us here in Florence. I would also like to dedicate my presentation to a very dear person of unparalleled sympathy and a lover of Brazilian popular music, who dedicated his last years and months of life to an activity characterized by generosity, that of editor, which he exercised with enormous dedication, even allowing some of my recent writings to be published in Italian in the review Il Poppante Saggio. How much we miss Gianni Guasto. My contribution to the discussion proposed by the Italian Society will be based on the ideas I presented in my book, Why Ferenczi, which will soon be translated into Italian. Carlo suggested that I talk about neocatharsis and its relationship with working through, a major characteristic of what I have called the empathic style created by Ferenczi at the end of the 1920s. A style inherited and developed by several important psychoanalysts, in particular Balint and Winnicott, and even by Lacan, who in turn also left heirs in contemporary psychoanalysis. The question that gives my book its title, Why Ferenczi, is immediately answered by the fact that there is no way of thinking about contemporary psychoanalysis without referring to Ferenczi and his empathic clinical style. Considering our time limit and your tolerance of my Latin English, I will work with you on the proposed topic in 5 points. Let's go to work. First point, working through in 1928 and 1930. In the problem of determination of analysis from 1928, there is a revealing passage about the meaning and importance of working through in the clinical style developed by Ferenczi as a result of his return to the problem of trauma in psychoanalysis. We read, during the time at our disposal, not only must all the psychic material be revived in the form of memories and repetitions, but the third technical resource of analysis must also be employed. I want to talk about the factor of analytical working through, to which Freud attributes an identical importance, but which has so far not been appreciated at its proper value. Ferenczi makes direct reference to Freud's 1914 essay, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, in which Freud presented the concept of working through to the psychoanalytic community for the first time, and perhaps for the last time, since he didn't go into the problem in any depth. In other words, by the mid-1920s, psychoanalysis was no longer just an exercise in memory, remembering past traumatic events or repeating them in the transferential field. there would also be a need for working through an obscure process that refers to the time needed by the patient to overcome their resistances and, conversely, also to the patience required by the analyst to endure their own pace. A little later, in Principle of Relaxation and Neocatharsis from 1930, Ferenczi illustrates with a fragment of a clinical case what working through demands of the psychoanalyst, especially with traumatized patients entangled in the incorporation of the persecutory object. It involves a patient who, after a few years of hostility, in other words, the negative transference, resulting from what Ferenczi described as a hard struggle with resistance, says to him, "Now that I love you, I can renounce you." Ferenczi's conclusion is that the fixation promoted in the analysis by the hatred directed at the object they couldn't get rid of, hatred that is directed at the analyst in the transference, is more restrictive than that produced by any love bond. In fact, for Ferenczi, all transferential adhesiveness, which have the effect of the internability of analysis, has as its driving force the hatred that could not gain expression. He writes, "Repressed hatred constituted a more powerful means of fixation and bonding than openly acknowledged tenderness." I believe that the neocatharsis proposed by Ferenczi, which has the principle of relaxation as a structuring element of the analytical setting, was the end point of his theoretical clinical journey, whose leitmotif was to explain the importance of Freud's formulation of the concept of working through, exploring its consequences for the radical transformation of what was understood by psychoanalytic treatment. In other words, after the publication of the 1914 text, psychoanalysis could no longer be the same. And with Ferenczi, the interpretative clinical style proposed by Freud, characterized by the tripod of free association, management of the transference according to the principle of abstinence, and interpretation, gave way to the empathical clinical style. Ferenczi was driven by two great ambitions: to broaden the applicability of psychoanalytic treatment to non-neurotic conditions, which required Freud to pay greater attention to the working through, and to avoid a repeat of iatrogenic situations like the one Freud and the Wolfman were involved in, which forced Freud to recognize the importance of the working through. So let's quickly go back to 1914. Working through in 1914. In the story of an infantile neurosis, published in 1919, shortly after the Budapest Congress, although it was almost entirely written in 1914, Freud presents the case of a young Russian, the noble Sergei Pankeyev, suffering from a severe obsessional neurosis who, after some unsuccessful attempts at treatment, arrived in Vienna at the beginning of 1910. In the very first chapter of the essay, Freud indicates that he was a serious patient whose analysis required a considerable amount of time by the standards of that time. Freud writes, "His fear of an autonomous existence was so great that it overpowered all the torments of the illness." After 3 years of analysis, the question of time, together with the perception that the treatment was stagnating due to Sergei's transference resistance, led Freud to experiment with an unprecedented device, setting a deadline for the end of the analysis, the main inspiration for the Ferencian active technique. The patient remained for a long time entrenched, inaccessible, behind a posture of docile indifference, writes Freud, adding, he listened, he understood, but he didn't allow anything to come close. His impeccable intelligence was as if disconnected from the drive forces that dominated his behavior in the few relationships he had left in life. Sergei was thus a kind of Teflon analysant. He didn't react to Freud's interpretations and was incapable of expressing any hostility in the transfers. In fact, Freud's description allows us to think of a real affective anesthesia resulting from an intelligence disconnected from the drive field. The effect of the pressure of time limit for the end of the analysis would have made the resistance and fixation on the illness give away. And Freud stresses, in a relatively short period, the analysis provided all the material that made it possible to lift the inhibitions and eliminate the symptoms. Thus, during 1914, Sergei recounted the famous dream of the silent white wolves sitting on the branches of the walnut tree, which gave his analyst the key to constructing the primary scene. At the age of 1.5, Sergei had witnessed his parents' coitus a tergo. Shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, in the summer of 1914, Freud discharged him, considering him profoundly and durably cured, and Sergei returned to Russia. However, the outcome of the case was not so favorable, at least for the patient. Shortly before the end of the war, Sergei returned to Vienna to analyze the remains of the transfers. Freud received him for a few months, but in 1926, Sergei began a new analysis, this time with Ruth Mark Brunswick. He had been suffering from paranoid hypochondria, which manifested itself after a minor surgical operation on his nose, and he suffered from persecutory feelings toward the doctors who attended him, Freud in particular. This scenario did indeed suggest a paranoid undertone, which led Brunswick to state that the patient has not succeeded in overcoming his father fixation, actualized in the transfers. Freud occupying the irreducible position of paternal substitute from which Sergei had never managed to detach himself. She says, Brunswick, in a lapidary phrase, we may, as analysts, be in full possession of the biographical facts of the illness, but we cannot know to what extent the patient needs to work through Durcharbeiten, his material in order to be cured. In the same summer of 1914, shortly after the discharge of the Wolfman, Freud wrote a crucial and transforming essay, which was included in the set of his recommendations on psychoanalytic technique, remembering, repeating, and working through, Durcharbeitung. The paragraphs dedicated to the concept are not very precise, especially compared to the usual clarity of his writing. In them, Freud uses categories that are little explored in his theory of the clinic, such as the analyst's patience and the experience, Erlebnis, in analysis. There is also a reference to the patient's time to go through his resistances. Freud writes, "This working through of resistances in practice can become a difficult task for the analysand and a test of patience for the doctor. But it is that part of the work which will have the most transformative influence on the patient and which differentiates analytic treatment from any influence by suggestion." Finally, Freud recovers the clinical importance of the ebb reaction of affect, apparently forgotten since the cathartic method was abandoned in 1890s. He writes that working through can be compared to the ebb reaction of the amounts of Affektbeträge, retained by repression, without which hypnotic treatment would have no influence at all. The specter of hypnosis and catharsis that marked the birth of psychoanalysis in the 19th century hangs over Freud's essay, insofar as the technique used with Sergei produced magical results in the sense of research, but was a real therapeutic disaster. On the other hand, the evocation of the concept of the ebb reaction of the affects at the conclusion of the exposition on working through is quite provocative. Everything indicates that for Freud, working through is to the psychoanalytic method what abreaction was to the cathartic method. So that's very important. Working through is to the psychoanalytic method what the abreaction was to the cathartic method. It's Ferenczi who will be able to draw all the consequences of this episode with the questions. Where is the resistance, after all? Where does it come from? And with his answer to these questions, the most intense resistances come from the analyst, not the analysand. In fact, with regard to the Wolfman, we are brought to a theoretical clinical crossroads at which we are faced with three hypotheses. First, either Freud or Brunswick was wrong about his diagnosis. Two, the Wolfman was the first borderline case in the history of psychoanalysis, having presented himself to Freud as a severe obsessive neurotic and to Brunswick as paranoid. And third, the paranoia that manifested itself in his analysis with Brunswick was produced by his experience of analysis with Freud, more specifically by the effects on his subjectivity of the setting of a deadline for the end of treatment, something quite intrusive. Of course, I opt for hypotheses 2 and 3. It means the Wolfman was not a classic obsessive neurotic, and the intrusive technique used by Freud in the name of the principle of abstinence provoked an updating of the traumatic nuclei of the analysand, triggering his psychosis. A letter from Ferenczi. I'm now going to read you a letter written by Ferenczi to Freud, dated January 17, 1930, the same year as the publication of The Relaxation Principle and Neocatharsis, a tragic testimony to an unsuccessful analysis. So we read, "In the beginning, you were my adored master and my inaccessible ideal for whom I harbored the well-known mixed feelings of a pupil. Unfavorable circumstances did not allow me to complete my analysis. Above all, I regret that in the analysis, you didn't discover and bring to the surface in me the negative feelings and fantasies that were partly transferred. And I wonder, even now, whether the mildness and indulgence of the representative of authority would not have been more appropriate. Ferenczi's testimony deeply affected Freud. He continued to provoke him for 7 years and was only answered in Analysis Terminable and Unterminable, 1937. Ferenczi had already died 4 years earlier, in 1933. In the second chapter of his essay, Freud presents his reply using 3 arguments. First, there were no signs of the negative transference, and the analyst can only work with what is manifest in the analysis. Second, provoking the negative transference would not be advisable since it would risk compromising the tender positive transference, the main ally of the treatment. And third, not everything is transference. There were also bonds of friendship during and after the analysis based on reality, not transference. We don't have time to discuss the meaning of friendship in Freud's work, nor in his relationship with his followers, Ferenczi in particular. But I can advance my reading that for Freud, friendship, as far as his disciples were concerned, implied accepting the authority of another man, in this case, accepting a paternal substitute. I'm going to focus on the first 2 arguments of Freud's reply based on an imaginary conversation with the ideas presented by Ferenczi, found in his journey towards the clinic of the traumatic, in other words, neocatharsis. Neocatharsis and empathic clinical style. Ferenczi anticipated the answer to the question about the presence or absence of the analysand's hostile affection in the transference in an essay entitled Provoked Fantasies from 1924. His reasoning is that in many clinical situations, the analysand cannot express signs of negative transference because, due to his own subjective configuration, that is, the identification with the aggressor to which he resorted as a defense against the trauma, obeying the imperative to preserve an idealized analyst, access to hostile affections and hatred is prevented. In addition, in order to be able to express their hostility in the transference, the analysand would need to trust in the survival of their analyst and, above all, be sure that there would be no retaliation. I recall here that Michael Balint, commenting on this episode, did not avoid sarcasm when he said that any analyst in training at the British Psychoanalytic Society after the Second World War would be severely reprimanded if he told his supervisor that he did not recognize signs of negative transference in his analysands. With regard to the second point, Freud's fear that activating the negative transference would jeopardize the treatment. Ferenczi would surely reply that the greatest obstacle to the expression of the negative transference is the psychoanalyst's resistance to recognizing it, which would force him to offer himself as its recipient, a very uncomfortable task. In the specific case of his analysis with Freud, the mixture of positions occupied by the Viennese adored master and creator of psychoanalysis, interested in the perpetuation of his work by his disciples, seems to have compromised the transferential experience and, consequently, Ferenczi's ability to complete his analysis. We can therefore see an uncomfortable similarity between the fates of Ferenczi's analysis and that of the Wolfman. Both cases reveal analyses that were not completed due to transferential, counter-transferential embarrassments. Above all, due to the difficulty their analyst, Freud in this case, had in recognizing negative feelings and fantasies in the transference of his two analyses. From the transferential entangled caused by his analysis, Ferenczi turned the problem of determination of analysis into one of his theoretical clinical obsessions, which culminated in the publication of two essays in 1928, Elasticity of the Psychoanalytic Technique and The Problem of Determination of Analysis. But determination of whose analysis? Well, determination of the analyst's analysis. In these essays, Ferenczi formulates the need to conceive of a second fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, the analysis of the analyst, in line with the fundamental rule of free association postulated by Freud. Thus, for Ferenczi, the conditions for free association to occur is for the analyst to have been analyzed, which would lead us to assume that, in fact, the analysis of the analyst would be the first and not the second rule for any analysis to take place. But it's only with the reading of the clinical diary written in 1932, but only published in the 1980s, that this argument gains consistency. In the insert of June 3, 1932, entitled No Special Didactic Analysis, Ferenczi questions both the didactics and the supervisions carried out by candidates in psychoanalytic training, stating that analysts who should be better analyzed were worse analyzed than their own patients, which could be corrected by a continuous complementary analysis. After all, for him, the best analyst is a cured patient. Finally, we read a warning: don't defend yourself against the criticism of the analysts themselves, who complain that they don't recognize any relaxation in their analyst's practice. The curious thing is that Ferenczi was a creator in the 1920s of didactic analysis. It was his initiative that the members of the secret committee, which would bring together Freud's closest disciples, undergo analysis with the master in order to transmit the pure theory unadulterated by personal complexes, avoiding new traumatic ruptures such as those of Adler and Jung. However, especially after the turning point in 1928, Ferenczi became a relentless critic of the institutionalization of the psychoanalytic movement, which adopted the training model proposed by Berlin as its paradigm, which contributed to him being dubbed the enfant terrible of psychoanalysis. For Ferenczi, the course of an analysis should produce the opposite of what psychoanalytic training produced, in the form of the incorporation of a technical superego that paradoxically imposed itself as a real obstacle to analysis. Also, in Elasticity of the Psychoanalytic Technique, Ferenczi proposed that A true analysis of character must set aside all kinds of superego, including that of the analyst. Only this kind of deconstruction of the superego can lead to a radical cure. Indeed, an analysis that promotes the incorporation of superego nuclei through identification with the analyst becomes traumatogenic, bringing the transference experience closer to identification with the aggressor. For Ferenczi, the formula by which the analysand should free himself from the superego does not mean depriving the subject of his ideals, but rather freeing him from the tyranny of the unconscious superego, its uninfluential dimension, therefore. In this way, in the end, the analysand will not have to obey this preconscious superego like a slave, as he previously obeyed the unconscious parental imago. Precisely in relation to his own analysis, in addition to the criticism that Freud had not paid attention to his negative transference, we find another painful testimony in the clinical diary. Ferenczi writes, "My own analysis cannot advance sufficiently in depth because my analyst, a narcissistic nature, according to his own confession, with his firm determination to remain in good health and his dislike of weaknesses and anomalies, could not accompany me to this depth and began too early with the education." He was talking about Freud. The problem of the analyst's good health appears in this passage as a criticism of the defenses employed by his analyst Freud. For Freud, preserving good health meant distancing himself from the suffering of his patients, their weaknesses and anomalies, keeping his narcissism intact. Thus, good health would actually be the effect of hypocrisy, the rejection of one's own feelings provoked by countertransference and the rejections of empathy, and would be equivalent in the relationship with the analysand to traumatic denial or disavowal, turning the analytical experience into a re-traumatization. Our friend from New York, Giselle Gaudi, she poses the expression Teflon analyst. It was my inspiration for the Teflon analysand.
Espressione Teflon
Analyst.
di Giselle Gaudi di New York, che è una delle colonne del nostro tempo.
Maintain yourself in good health. This is precisely the opposite of what is advocated by empathic style, in which the psychoanalyst offers himself for an affective encounter with the analysand, the only way in return to affect him, the analysand, with his punctuations, interpretations, constructions, and even with his meaningful silence. The analytical position requires not only strict control of one's own narcissism, writes Ferenczi in Elasticity of the Psychoanalytic Technique, but also keen vigilance on one's various affective reactions. Last point, the health of the psychoanalyst. The idea that the psychoanalyst is called upon to adopt a sensitive presence without denying their feelings, that is, without hypocrisy or denial, leads Ferenczi to research the metapsychology of the analyst's psychic processes during analysis, which in the course of the session oscillates between the empathic experience on one hand and self-control and intellectual activity on the other. A passage from elasticity of the psychoanalytic technique is quite enlightening about the complexity of psychoanalysts' work. The patient's free associations are allowed to act on him, on the analyst, and at the same time, one's own imagination is allowed to play with this associative material. In the meantime, the new connections are compared with the previous results of the analysis without neglecting, even for an instant, the examination and criticism of one's own tendencies. Ferenczi concludes his presentation of the empathetic style in psychoanalysis by indicating that the overload to which the analyst is exposed would oblige the psychoanalytic field to reflect on a particular hygiene of the analyst, which I will call here the analyst's health, not with now, with a capital H, a great health according to Nietzschean inspiration. Precisely the end of analysis by providing free motility of the libido and the possibility of simply enjoying life would be the privileged path to the health and hygiene of the analyst. For Ferenczi, the health of the psychoanalyst will be synonymous with elasticity. Therefore, in the problem of determination of analysis, Ferenczi reiterates his conviction that there is no difference in principle between therapeutic analysis and didactic analysis. The distinction arises from the fact that the patient can interrupt their analysis whenever they see fit, while the analysts in their training process should have completely finished their own analysis. Our task of working through is therefore endless. Thank you for your attention.